Here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. 32%. That's the increase in just 5 years in the number of people formally requesting adjustments to how they are assessed in education and professional environments. 32%. And that is not a rounding error. That is a signal. Now, what if I told you that the real story behind that number isn't a crisis, it's a revolution? What if the friction that an estimated 10 to 20% of the global population experiences every single day, not because of a lack of intelligence, not because of a lack of creativity, not because of a lack of ambition, but because the systems we built were never designed for their minds? What if that friction is finally being dissolved, not by policy, not by legislation, but by artificial intelligence? Welcome to Mindcast. I'm Will. Today, we are going deep. The topic sits at the crossroads of technology, neuroscience, and the future of media production. We are talking about generative AI, not as a job killer, not as a content factory, and not as a shortcut for the lazy. We are talking about a structural redesign of who gets to participate in the creative economy. Today's episode draws on research titled The Cognitive Atelier, Generative AI, Accessibility, and the Redefinition of Creative Authorship. 3 major insights are on the table: how AI functions as a cognitive prosthesis for neurodivergent minds, why the inauthentic critique collapses when you look at art history and comedy, and the macro-level shift happening right now in the creator economy. Whether you identify as neurodivergent, work alongside people who do, or simply want new perspectives on human potential, this episode is built for you. Let's get into it. Key Insight 1: AI as Accessibility Architecture. Let's start with cognitive load theory. First formalized by educational psychologist John Sweller, the idea is straightforward. The human brain has a finite working memory. When the demands of a task exceed that capacity, when you're juggling too many mental operations at once, performance degrades. You make mistakes. You slow down. You get exhausted faster. For most people, the cognitive load of writing an article or producing a podcast is manageable, if effortful. But for someone with severe dyslexia, that same task doesn't just feel harder, it is structurally harder. The cognitive overhead of decoding letters, managing spelling, constructing grammatically correct sentences, and simultaneously holding the thread of an argument, all of that is operating simultaneously, and it is relentless. It is a tax that gets charged on every single word. Now, here's where a concept from researcher Lynn Anderson Inman becomes powerful. She coined the phrase wheelchair for the mind to describe what assistive technology can do for cognitively diverse individuals. Think about what a wheelchair actually does. It does not make the person in it less capable. It does not diminish their intelligence, their autonomy, or their contribution. It removes a physical barrier that would otherwise prevent them from moving through spaces that were designed without their needs in mind. The wheelchair is not a shortcut. It is an equalizer. Anderson Inman's argument is that the right technology can do exactly the same thing for cognitive access. And what the research behind today's episode argues, compellingly, is that generative AI is the most powerful version of that cognitive wheelchair we have ever seen. Let's look at the empirical evidence, because the data backs this up. A study from Nottingham Trent University examined how neurodivergent students and emerging professionals were engaging with generative AI tools. The findings were striking. 46%, almost half, reported that generative AI felt specifically engineered to meet their needs. Not adapted, not sort of helpful, specifically engineered. 59% said they used generative AI to help them understand and process complex material, essentially using it as a real-time interpreter between dense information and their own comprehension. And then there's the Scottish Qualifications Authority data from the top of the episode, a 32% increase in requests for assessment adjustments since 2019. That is not a cohort of people gaming the system. That is a population finally feeling empowered enough to name what they need. and in many cases, discovering that AI tools are already quietly providing it.
So, what does this actually look like in practice? Consider a creator with severe dyslexia, someone with a mind overflowing with ideas and insights, but for whom translating those ideas into polished prose is an exhausting, error-prone ordeal. Legacy broadcast and publishing workflows demand that one person fluently research, outline, draft, revise, and produce. For a neurodivergent creator, that workflow doesn't just disadvantage them, it actively silences them. But now imagine an AI pipeline. Gemini for research synthesis, Claude for script drafting, a synthetic voice engine for audio delivery. Suddenly, the creative barrier is not the ability to spell or construct a grammatical sentence. The barrier is the quality of your thinking, your conceptual intent, your editorial taste. A game where neurodivergent minds that often think in vivid, non-linear, associative patterns, may actually have an edge.
This brings us to the second major insight, and the one I think is most intellectually satisfying: the creator versus executor paradigm. Because the moment you start talking about AI assisting in content creation, a chorus of skepticism follows. Is it really your work if a machine helped you make it? Is it authentic? Is it cheating? I understand the instinct. There's a romanticized idea of the lone creative genius, hunched over a desk in the small hours, bleeding meaning onto the page with nothing but bare hands and a burning lamp. It is also, historically speaking, quite wrong. Let me take you to Antwerp, 17th century, the studio of Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens was one of the most celebrated painters of his era. His canvases are enormous, luminous, technically breathtaking. But Rubens did not paint most of them alone. He operated an atelier, a workshop, employing apprentices and specialist painters. One person handled fabric and drapery, another landscapes, another animal figures. Rubens himself typically painted the faces and applied the final retouches that unified everything into a coherent vision. He also worked through the Medley system, small preparatory sketches that served as creative blueprints for his studio team. The vision was entirely Rubens, the execution was distributed, and not a single art historian today questions whether a Rubens is a Rubens. The authorship is not in the brushstroke. It is in the vision, the direction, and the curatorial eye. Sound familiar? Now let's cross the channel to the BBC. The two Ronnies, Ronnie Corbett and Ronnie Barker, is one of the most beloved sketch comedy shows in British television history. The writing team received scripts from a mysterious contributor named Gerald Wiley. Nobody at the BBC knows who Gerald Wiley is, so the producers simply evaluate the work on its merits. And the work is consistently outstanding, sharp, original, brilliantly constructed. Sketches like Four Candles, one of the most celebrated pieces of wordplay comedy ever broadcast, came from this anonymous pen. Eventually, the identity is revealed. Gerald Wiley was Ronnie Barker himself, submitting under a pseudonym so his material would be judged on quality alone, not celebrity. Here is the staggering punchline. Barker authored approximately 75% of all the two Ronnies' material over the show's run, and his creative identity was never in question. Nobody said the comedy wasn't really his because he used a pseudonym. The creative value resided in the wit and intelligence of the writing. The pipeline through which it arrived was irrelevant. Apply these two stories directly to a modern AI-assisted workflow, and the argument against authenticity simply collapses. When a creator with dyslexia uses an AI tool to translate their ideas into polished prose, they are doing precisely what Rubens did with his atelier, setting the vision, directing the execution, and applying their editorial taste to the final product. When that same creator uses an AI voice engine to deliver their content, they are doing precisely what Barker did when he separated his identity from his output, trusting the substance to carry the day. The tools have changed. The creative logic is centuries old, and this matters enormously because the framing we use to evaluate creative work has real consequences for who we allow into the conversation. Key Insight 3: Broader Implications. The Future Creator Economy. We've established that AI is a genuine cognitive prosthesis for neurodivergent creators, and we've demolished the authenticity objection. Now let's zoom all the way out, because what is happening here is not just about accessibility. It is about a fundamental restructuring of economic value in the creative industries. Generative AI is driving the marginal cost of content production towards zero. Think about what that means. It used to cost significant time, money, and effort to produce well-researched, professionally delivered content. Those costs created a natural barrier to entry, and for the most part, the people best positioned to clear that barrier were those whose cognitive profile aligned with the dominant workflow: linear thinkers, strong spellers, fluent writers, confident verbal communicators. In other words, neurotypical people. The research calls this the neurotypical tax, the invisible premium that media historically charged neurodivergent creators simply to participate. You had to operate the machinery of production fluently before anyone would look at what you were trying to say. And the tragic irony is that many of the most original, most creatively generative minds were on the wrong side of that barrier, not because their ideas weren't good enough, but because the pipeline required fluency in execution, not just brilliance in conception. Now, as AI drives execution costs towards zero, syntax becomes a commodity. Grammar, spelling, formatting, no longer premium skills. The scarce resource shifts to 4 fundamentally human capacities: conceptual intent, knowing what you want to say and why it matters; prompt choreography, directing AI tools with precision and nuance; editorial curation and taste, evaluating outputs and refining toward a specific creative vision; and contextual discrimination, knowing when AI serves the work and when human instinct must override it. These 4 capacities are not learned from a grammar textbook. They emerge from deep thinking, lived experience, intellectual curiosity, and creative boldness, capacities that neurodivergent minds often possess in abundance. What we are seeing is the emergence of what the research calls the executive showrunner model. Think about how a television showrunner operates. They don't write every word of every script. They don't operate the camera. They don't edit the footage. But the show is undeniably theirs because they hold the vision, set the creative direction, and make the final calls on every meaningful decision. In the AI-enabled creator economy, that role becomes accessible to neurodivergent creators for the first time, not because the work is being done for them, but because the mechanical barriers between their vision and its execution have been systematically removed. That is not a shortcut. That is liberation. And the broader implication for the creator economy? If 10 to 20% of the global population has historically been locked out of full creative participation, and we are now building the infrastructure to unlock them, we are talking about a wave of original voices and ideas entering public discourse that has never had a platform before. That is not a marginal change. That is a civilizational upgrade in the diversity and richness of our collective creative output. The question is whether our institutions, our broadcasters, publishers, and commissioning editors are ready to recognize vision and curation as the primary creative currency, because if they keep optimizing for execution, they will miss it entirely.
All right, let's bring this all together. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I want to make sure you leave with more than a feeling. I want you to leave with a framework. 3 concrete, practical takeaways. Takeaway 1, audit your definition of creativity. If your internal definition of creative work is still tied to manual execution, to the idea that real creativity means doing everything yourself, it is time to upgrade. The history of art, literature, and comedy tells us clearly and repeatedly that the locus of creative value is in the vision and the curation, not the execution.
Rubens is studio, Barker's pseudonym, and today's AI-assisted creators are all operating from the same fundamental principle. Ask yourself honestly, are you evaluating the quality of someone's ideas or the smoothness of their delivery mechanism? Because only one of those actually matters.
Takeaway 2. If you are neurodivergent, or if you support, manage, or commission neurodivergent creators, treat AI tools as first-class accessibility infrastructure, not as a guilty secret or a workaround. The data from Nottingham, Trent is clear. Nearly half of neurodivergent users feel these tools were built for them. That feeling is legitimate. If an AI pipeline allows a creator with dyslexia to produce work that accurately reflects their intellectual capability, work previously being filtered out by cognitive load barriers, then using that pipeline is not cheating. It is removing an obstacle that should never have been there. Start building those pipelines intentionally. Identify where your cognitive load is highest. Experiment with which AI tools reduce it most effectively, and focus your energy where it genuinely belongs, on the depth and originality of your ideas.
Takeaway 3. Begin developing the 4 non-computational human capacities that will define creative value in the AI era: conceptual intent, prompt choreography, editorial curation and taste, and contextual discrimination. Conceptual intent means sharpening your ability to articulate what you want to say, to have a genuine point of view worth sharing. Prompt choreography means learning to direct AI tools with precision, which is itself a creative skill that rewards practice. Editorial taste means developing the judgment to know when something is good, when it's almost good, and when it needs to be scrapped. And contextual discrimination means knowing when human instinct must lead and the tool must follow. These are the skills no amount of automation can replace, and the skills that will define the most valuable creators of the next decade.
We started today with 32%. Not a crisis, but a revolution. The neurotypical tax that has silenced so many brilliant, original minds for so long is being dismantled, not by a campaign, not by a policy document, but by tools that, when used with intentionality, function as the most powerful cognitive equalizer in the history of human communication. Rubens knew creative value lives in the vision. Ronnie Barker knew creative identity is in the substance, not the surface. Anderson Inman knew the right technology doesn't make us less human, it makes us more fully ourselves. The Cognitive Atelier, a studio for the mind where the artist directs, the technology executes, and the work that emerges is entirely authentically human. I find that genuinely exciting. I hope you do too.
That is going to wrap things up for today's episode of Mindcast. If this conversation has sparked something for you, a question, a challenge, a new way of looking at your own creative process, then the episode has done its job. The research I've drawn on today isn't publicly available for general circulation, but I will be sharing additional context, key references, and my own reflections in the show notes, so do check those out. And here is what I would love for you to do. If Mindcast brings you value, please subscribe wherever you're listening right now. It is the single most important thing you can do to help this show grow. And if you have a moment, leave a review, even just a line or two. It genuinely makes a difference, and it helps other curious minds find their way to these conversations. I'm Will. This has been Mindcast. Take care of yourselves. Keep asking the big questions, and I will see you in the next one.